Order, order. We start with questions to the Minister for the Cabinet Office, Paulette.
Question number 1, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I would like to answer question 1 and 9 together. The emergency alert system is a vital tool for warning and informing in the case of a serious incident where there is a threat to life. Under this government, we have used the tool 5 times, including the last ever deployment for Storm Irwin. We are implementing lessons identified, including improved targeting into alert mechanisms.
Paulette.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A secret phone can be a lifeline for survivors of domestic abuse. Can the Minister tell the House what steps the government is taking to ensure that when emergency alerts are sent, survivors of domestic abuse are not put in any additional danger? Thank you, Minister.
My honourable friend raises an incredibly important point. The whole purpose of the emergency alert is to make people safer. So we are mindful of the potential risks which could pose to people with secret phones, such as victims of domestic abuse. We are continuing to work with domestic abuse charities and organisations that support victims to mitigate this risk, including by producing a guidance to disabling emergency alerts.
Speaker, the threat of flooding is ever present in Carlisle, and whilst myself and other local residents regularly receive flood alerts, they don't necessarily distinguish between a threat to life and a regular flood alert. Could the Minister please explain at what point the flood alerts would be updated to reflect the seriousness of an emergency alert?
My honourable friend is right to raise this question. The Environment Agency is responsible for issuing flood warnings. For locations covered by severe flood warnings, the Environment Agency may ask for an emergency alert to be activated, and this is where there is immediate threat to life and to support the response in the local area.
Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Honourable Lady very much for her response? It's good that we have this system right across this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. All our constituents can respond to it. There is a very clear role. There's 2 things. First of all, the response from the whether it be domestic abuse, whether it be a flood warning or whatever it be, how quick can that happen? And secondly, my understanding is that I thought that the councils had a role to play in relation to that. And if they do have, maybe the Minister could just reinforce and remind us of the role that councils have. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for raising this important question. In terms of the emergency alerts, we do work very closely with the local authorities and also the local resilience forums when looking to issue emergency alert to make sure the response is as adequate as possible.
11.
Question number 2, sir.
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government's working hard to improve the cyber resilience of the public sector because, of course, cyber attacks can be against either central government institutions, local authorities and, of course, individuals and businesses. With regard to local authorities, the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government launched the Cyber Assessment Framework for local government. It sets a clear cyber security standard for the sector, and the Department also provides monthly cyber clinics to support local authorities in improving collaboration, sharing intelligence and tackling vulnerabilities in this area.
11.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Local councils manage mountains of sensitive data. They deliver essential services and lead on emergency responses to critical incidents, among much more. And yet 15 years of Tory underfunding has left outdated digital infrastructure, leaving them particularly vulnerable to cyber attack. Does the Minister agree with me that improving cyber resilience in local authorities is of paramount importance if we are to protect the data of our citizens and continue to deliver essential services without interruption from hostile actors?
My honourable friend is absolutely right in what he says. The truth is, not all of the systems used across central or local government are as up to date as they should be. This is a constant battle and a constant challenge, and it's really important that we put every effort in to make sure that we are as well protected as possible against hostile acts from both state and non-state actors.
Sir Olney, Liberal Democrat, spokesperson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This week, the United States Defence Secretary Hegseth has announced the stepping back of US counter-cyber measures against Russia. This is an incredibly concerning decision by the Americans and threatens not only their cybersecurity but also our own. The Russian government has been accused of orchestrating a widespread campaign of interference and disinformation that seeks to undermine the global order. And in 2020, the UK Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee stated that the government had underestimated the response required to the Russian threat. So can the Secretary of State tell us what further measures the government are taking to protect British democracy and also commit to publishing the full unredacted Russia report? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, we are fully alive to the threat posed by Russian cyber attacks. I mentioned in my previous answer the threat from state and non-state actors, sometimes state-backed actors against our public infrastructure. So we will work as hard as possible to protect our institutions against such attacks. And I do say that our intelligence cooperation with the United States remains a very important part of our defences.
Brenna Baxter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 3.
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the Government is taking action to strengthen our cyber security and to protect our digital economy. The Home Office has also launched a public consultation on proposals to tackle ransomware, which is one of the most malicious types of attack, to protect UK businesses, to improve reporting and to strike a blow to those who would use this model of organised crime. However, this is a major challenge, as I've said, and it's an ongoing battle against those who seek to do us harm, to extort money and to undermine the delivery of crucial public services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share some of the concerns expressed by the honourable member opposite. Last week I spoke to businesses and officials working within Ukraine's critical national infrastructure who are on the front line of Russian cyber attacks. They told me that since the invasion there have been cyber attacks on virtually every aspect of Ukrainian life, highlighting the scope of damage they have on civilian and military operations. Can my right honourable friend say a little more about how we are learning the lessons from this conflict and what we are doing to protect our own national infrastructure from Russian cyber attacks?
I thank my honourable friend. The Government is helping Ukraine's cyber defenders to detect, disrupt and deter Russian cyber attacks. The programme is backed by £16 million worth of UK funding, using world-leading expertise from both the private and public sector to protect Ukraine's critical national infrastructure, because we understand that a protection of cyber assets is part of modern warfare, and we are using this help for Ukraine just as we have supplied them with a large number of weapons over the past 3 years.
Mr. Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. ByteDance, the company that owns TikTok, as a Chinese company, is required to have an in-house Chinese Communist Party committee. We all know that attacks from China on our national infrastructure, as well as on our cyber networks, are becoming increasingly common, and it's clear that elements of the Chinese government are behind these. Yet, astonishingly, the government is still failing to fully declare ministerial meetings with TikTok representatives. Will the Secretary of State ensure that TikTok, given its huge presence in the media space, that its meetings with executives are declared by government ministers alongside other senior media executive registrations, considering the massive public influence that TikTok has and the known cyber risks posed by this Chinese platform?
Mr. Speaker, there's a well-established process for transparency returns on meetings between government ministers and outside organisations, and TikTok will be treated in that in the same way as anyone else.
Dave Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will answer questions 4, 7, 11, 12, 13, 17 and 20 together. Well, some of the team get a cup of tea. I think the wide-ranging interest in this topic shows just how much the $400 billion that is spent in the public sector on procurement matters for growth, and it matters for communities around the UK. I was in Grimsby recently, where small businesses were delivering growth locally, innovating and providing more than half of local employment. And MPs here know that SMEs are vital for providing that local employment in their communities. But under the last government, we became overly reliant on large consultants and a small number of big companies. We have too often ended up locked into expensive, poor-performing contracts with companies able to drive up prices in closed markets. This has to change. The new National Procurement Policy Statement asks the public sector to maximise procurement spend with small and medium-sized enterprises, and we're leading the way in government by setting ambitious public targets for departments on spend for small and medium-sized businesses.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am quite glad I am at the front of this particular queue. Right across the country, we have amazing cutting-edge businesses like Great Wave AI, a start-up in my constituency, who are already helping government take advantages of AI, but they want to grow faster and do more work with government departments. What work is the Minister doing to ensure that small British start-ups can play their part in the AI revolution in government, not just mega companies like Meta, Microsoft and Google?
Thank you to my honourable friend for that question. We've been absolutely clear that there are huge opportunities for AI to support the public sector, to better personalise services and save money. But we have to keep up with the speed and pace of innovation in how we buy. And I've particularly heard from SMEs specialising in AI and digital transformation that the way we're doing procurement is too slow and too inflexible to keep up with that pace. It's why I'm working with the Minister for AI and Digital Government to set up a new digital commercial centre for excellence to make sure that this changes and that we have the best innovation from your constituency and around the country in government.
Sir Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, Luton Airport invested £110 million in local businesses. They know the value of businesses, particularly small and medium enterprises in places like Luton. Every weekend, every Saturday, I do a Small Business Saturday shout-out. What can we do to ensure that those small businesses in Luton get a fair crack of the whip when it comes to public sector procurement?
It's brilliant to hear about the honourable member's leadership on supporting small businesses and the work they're doing in your constituency, and we're absolutely determined that SMEs have a fair crack, and the new National Procurement Policy Statement asks us to maximise spend with small businesses, but also set stretching targets for each department that will be publicly, transparently brought to this House, and we will be held account for delivering on those.
Ewan Stenbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The targets in the National Procurement Policy Statement for government departments to buy from British SMEs is strongly welcomed. The benefit will be long-term, will broaden essential sources of investment, and we will improve our economy's domestic resilience. Bus manufacturing is an area that needs domestic resilience, with over 100 jobs recently lost in the Falkirk area because the previous government failed to support British buses. With the bus expert panel next week, does the Minister expect to see a general increase in domestic procurement following the updated National Procurement Policy Statement?
As soon as I saw the honourable member's name on the order paper, I knew that he would be raising buses, because he has never failed to miss an opportunity to raise this critical issue with me. The government is absolutely committed to supporting the UK's domestic bus manufacturing industry and ensuring the procurement system recognises the high standards and quality of UK manufacturers. The new National Procurement Policy Statement aligns with our industrial strategy and pushes us to maximise spend with SMEs. As a result, contracting authorities across the country must now consider how their procurement strategies can support the industrial strategy, including the bus manufacturing strategy.
Jack Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recent figures have shown that hundreds of small businesses have been opening up across Ipswich, and I am proud that we are now ranked in one of the top 10 areas in the country where the number of SMEs are growing. However, I am ambitious for my town and I want to go further. So can I ask the Minister, what steps are the government taking to ensure that, as part of our skills agenda, young people in towns like Ipswich have the chance to find skilled, long-term, well-paid employment with SMEs, and in doing so boost public procurement, easy for me to say, and our local economy too?
We know that there is so much young talent in Ipswich and communities around the country, but too many young people are struggling to get onto the employment ladder, and we know the scarring impact that has in their lives, and we need to make sure that the £400 billion spent on public procurement means something in communities like Ipswich. Mr. Speaker, we are streamlining how we measure social and economic value, so they're very clear asks linked to the missions, including the Opportunity Mission, delivering jobs and skills to young people out of work. And now we're asking those who win government contracts to make sure that they're advertising those contracts in local job centres, so people in Ipswich and communities around the UK are getting the benefit of government contracts.
Debbie Ebra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In January, it was reported that nearly 7,000 construction firms were on the brink of insolvency, and that's on top of the 4,000 that folded last year. And a major cause of this is payment delays by large contractors. Given that project bank accounts protect against payment delays, they are only used by some government departments, but not others, will the Minister act where the previous government failed to and introduce these across all government departments?
Mr. Speaker, I really welcome this question. It's so important to small businesses that they are paid on time, and I've heard time and time again that late payments threaten their very existence. The construction playbook says that project bank accounts should be used unless compelling reasons not to, but we are determined to crack down on late payments. We've announced regular spot checks on payments throughout our supply chains. And in the budget, the Chancellor said that government will be required to exclude suppliers from bidding for major contracts if they can't demonstrate they pay within an average of 45 days. And I very much welcome the honourable members, my honourable friends' work on this. I very much enjoyed meeting you. I know you've built a wide coalition, and I hope we continue to work together on these important issues.
Jess Asselter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pathways Care Farm is an amazing charity in Lowestoft which supports people with disabilities, mental health issues and ex-offenders to get back on their feet by working with animals and growing food. Indeed, they have excellent outcomes, particularly in relation to helping people to get work ready and improve their health, but they find it hard to access opportunities for public contracts, such as social prescribing, because they're such a small charity. Does the Minister agree with me that VCSE organisations and charities like Pathways have an important role to play in providing solutions for the public sector?
Mr. Speaker, I wholeheartedly agree. My honourable friend from Great Grimsby and Cleethorpes took me to a similar farm in her constituency set up by an ex-prison officer. And I have to say that it was one of the most enjoyable visits I've had, and very good for my mental health to be feeding some alpacas and goats. I've also heard very powerful stories of how social prescribing has changed lives, from ending chronic loneliness, or somebody that I met recently who had his first stable home in his 50s. The new NPPS specifically asked contracting authorities to maximise spend with voluntary sector organisations, and we're going to be introducing targets for government on spend with voluntary sector organisations and social enterprises. And the government has listened to concerns from local authorities, and we're working to implement changes to allow them to reserve competitions for low-value contracts for local organisations.
Bill Platt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last but not least. But I think the mass grouping of this question on this particular subject proves the failure of the last government in order to get a grip on this particular issue. So can the Minister reassure me and SMEs, such as WJ Structures and Rothwell's in my constituency, that this government will take steps to simplify the process, therefore keeping the pound local instead of contracts going to multinationals?
Mr. Speaker, I very much welcome the question. I could happily speak about procurement all day because it is absolutely critical for delivering the government missions. The Procurement Act does remove some of these challenges, but we need to do more, and that's why we're setting ambitious and stretching targets for direct spend on SMEs, and I've asked officials to review particularly our framework contracts to make sure that they're more accessible to SMEs. The challenges that the businesses in your constituency have raised are challenges I've heard from SMEs around the country, that our procurement is too complex, too slow, and we need to change it. We need to get that $400 billion into real jobs and SMEs in our communities.
Desmond Sway.
I congratulate the Government Whip's office. What discussions have been had with the Crown Commercial Service regarding Romeo Mike 2677 network?
Yes. It's what everyone was thinking.
I thank you very much to my honourable friend for the question, and I look forward to spending another day with you in the Forward Committee later. I have regular discussions with the Crown Commercial Service on a range of issues.
Peter Bradford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that public sector procurement accounts for a third of all public sector spending, what steps is the Minister taking to ensure that it is less siloed, more joined up and as efficient as the private sector?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I think it's such an important question. We need to deliver value for money on how we do procurement. And one of the changes we made in the new NPPS is ensuring that contracting authorities are collaboratively procuring and cracking down on some of the excessive costs of private frameworks and making sure that they are transparent. We are using AI to try and streamline procurement, and we've set up a new commercial innovation at the heart of government to make sure that we are buying for challenges that support innovation and growth.
Andrew Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 5.
Mr. Speaker, last month I laid regulations that, subject to parliamentary approval, will give the Infected Blood Compensation Authority the powers it needs to pay compensation to all eligible people via all routes. My aim is for these regulations to be enforced by the 31st of March to enable IBCA to begin payments to all eligible groups this year.
Andrew Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was contacted by a constituent last year who tragically lost her husband to infected blood, and I'm continuing to support her. There's an understandable lack of trust between victims and the authorities after such a long wait for justice, and my constituent is concerned about the urgency in compensating affected families. When he spoke in the House last month, the Minister committed to producing an easy-read version of the regulations. Can he say when this is likely to be published? And will he commit to full transparency on the progress of settling claims?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, by the end of the month, I will publish a simplified version of the document explaining the Infected Blood Compensation Scheme. Transparency is vital, and whilst IBCA is an independent body, I know they are committed to being open with the community, and they publish monthly figures that show the progress on compensation claims.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Minister's progress in this area. I visited IBCA on the 30th of January and was impressed by the professionalism of the team up there, and the Minister has been accessible to me since for me to give him feedback. One issue that has come up has been the question of the need for non-disclosure agreements or terms to be signed up to by recipients of payments. I'm very anxious that misunderstandings don't arise consequential of this. Could the Minister use his good offices to implore IBCA to explain why that happens, and if they can't do it, perhaps he could explain to the House the reasons that might be necessary?
First, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for his work as Paymaster General. Indeed, I was pleased to facilitate his recent visit to IBCA, and I'm grateful for the constructive approach he continues to take. With regard to the specific issue that he raises around the contracts that IBCA has entered into, I entirely agree with him about the need for transparency, and that's something I am re-emphasising to IBCA.
Andrew Ranger.
Number 6, please, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, since entering government, we have reset working relations with the devolved governments, and I'm now working to support these efforts. All 3 tiers of the intergovernmental structures are in operation. Several of the portfolio-level interministerial groups have met, while the middle-tier interministerial standing committee and finance interministerial standing committee both met just last Thursday. The top-tier meeting between the Prime Minister and the heads of the devolved governments also met alongside the Council of the Nations and Regions in October. Of course, these formal structures are not the sum total of our engagement. We continue to collaborate closely on issues affecting citizens in all parts of the country.
Reg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Although much of public service delivery is devolved, all 4 nations face a shared challenge of reforming these services in a tight fiscal environment. What can the nations learn from one another about reforming these services? And does he agree it is important that they do learn from one another? Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a key and important challenge in every part of these islands. Public services need both resources and reform, given the inheritance of this government back in July. The UK Health Secretary has set out ambitious plans to roll out new AI technologies, upgrade the NHS app and reform the healthcare system to bring down waiting lists. Just last week, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, met with devolved government ministers to discuss public service reform, data sharing and harnessing the public service reform work across these islands.
Peter Prinsley, Dr. Peter Prinsley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question number.
Yes, question 8.
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, a closer, more cooperative relationship with the EU is in the UK's national interests. It will grow the economy, boost living standards, protect our borders and keep the UK safe. I am taking forward discussions with my EU counterpart, Commissioner Maroš Šefčovič, and the UK EU Leaders Summit on the 19th of May will be an important opportunity to drive forward this agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So Palmerston said that this country has no eternal allies and no perpetual enemies, only interests which are eternal and perpetual. So would the Minister agree with me that it's in our eternal interests for there to be security in Europe and a sovereign Ukraine? And would he also agree with me to congratulate the Prime Minister on his statesmanship leadership at this very dangerous moment?
I certainly join my honourable friend in congratulating the Prime Minister on the careful, considered leadership that he is showing at a time when we face a once-in-a-generation moment for the collective security of our country and our continent. We remain absolutely committed to securing a lasting peace in Ukraine. On the 2nd of March, the Prime Minister hosted international leaders in London to discuss support for Ukraine, and as he said, and I quote, "We will never choose between either side of the Atlantic. The past week has shown that idea to be totally unserious. We are stepping up on defence and security, and we know Europe is stepping up too."
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I was in Ukraine where, following Trump's betrayal, the need for European solidarity to defend our democracy has never been more evident. And the unintended consequence of Brexit for our economy and our security are certainly very real, and it's increasingly obvious that the UK cannot afford the luxury of splendid isolation. So in the spirit of nothing being off the table, will his department start that discussion in government about the UK moving to the customs union and a single market membership? Because the closer and the quicker we align with our European partners, the safer we will all be.
Well, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I always thought the SNP's policy was one of splendid isolation. But that certainly is not the UK government's policy, and indeed we are working very closely with our European partners, and that's precisely the leadership the Prime Minister has been showing in the past week.
So, Secretary of State Alex Burkhardt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We appear, regrettably, to be witnessing the start of a global trade war. Over the past week, the United States has placed tariffs on some of its major trading partners, and they have retaliated in kind. The President has said that he intends to place tariffs of 25% on EU goods very soon. Should this happen, it's highly likely that the EU will respond. Now, even if the United Kingdom were to avoid tariffs, the consequences for Northern Ireland could be particularly complex. What conversations has the Paymaster General had with his European counterparts to ensure that Northern Ireland is not caught in the crossfire of a trade war?
Firstly, Mr. Speaker, we have a strong and very proud tradition over centuries of free trade here in the United Kingdom, and we will continue to make that case. With regard to our specific trading relationship with the United States, the Right Honourable Gentleman will have seen, after conversations between the Prime Minister and the President in the Oval Office last Thursday, that we wish to deepen our trading relationship with the United States. Specifically on Northern Ireland, I understand completely the point that he is raising, and we will continue to monitor the impact of any such policy on Northern Ireland.
Alex Burkhardt.
Thanks. I'm grateful to the Paymaster General for his response, but it does sound from that as though he has not yet had any conversations with his EU counterparts on this issue. I appreciate that he's got a meeting on the 19th of May, but I'm sure he will understand that tariffs may come much sooner than that. That being the case, first, will he undertake to talk to his European counterparts? And second, to come and give a statement to this House as soon as he has done so, so that we can understand that the government is preparing for this eventuality. Can he also make clear to our friends in Europe that should trade and manufacturing be disrupted in Northern Ireland, we will not hesitate to use our powers under Article 16 of the Windsor Framework to protect businesses there?
Just to reassure the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Windsor Framework Task Force is based in the Cabinet Office, and I am regularly discussing issues on Northern Ireland with my European counterparts, and I can assure him I'll be speaking to Maros Sefcovic on a number of occasions prior to the 19th of May. So I hope he will take that reassurance. He should also be reassured that we will, of course, always act in the best interest of the people of Northern Ireland.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. 2 weeks ago, I was glad to read reports in the Times that the government intends to introduce a youth mobility scheme between the UK and the EU. This would be good for our economy whilst providing young British people the opportunity to work and study abroad. And this is what the British public want. New polling shows that more than 2/3 of the UK population are in favour of such a scheme. However, last week the Home Secretary ruled this out. Will the Minister do the right thing, remove the unnecessary barriers facing young people in the UK and commit to negotiations on an EU-UK youth mobility scheme?
Mr Speaker, the position of the Government is unchanged. We have no plans for a youth mobility scheme. We'll, of course, always listen to sensible proposals from the EU, but they have to be within our red lines of no return to freedom of movement, no return to the single market and no return to the customs union.
Mark Seward.
Question number 10, Mr Speaker.
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions number 10 and 14 together. I'm pleased to report to the House that we are making progress in delivering our plan for change. After years of rising NHS waiting lists under the Conservatives, those waiting lists are now falling. And last month, we announced that we had met our first step pledge to deliver 2 million additional NHS appointments 7 months early. In addition to that, the first 750 breakfast clubs will be opening in April to help children get the best start to their learning day, and our new criminal justice legislation is being introduced to protect the public from crime and antisocial behaviour, including the introduction of respect orders targeted at known troublemakers in our local communities.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. I was proud to vote for the £22.6 billion increase in NHS spending, which means that we are getting 2 million more appointments 7 months early, which means that waiting lists are coming down. And of course, there is still a long way to go, and the British public deserve to know that every penny of that extra investment is being spent as efficiently as possible. So can the Minister update the House on what the government's plans are to reform the NHS to ensure that every single penny is spent wisely?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. The additional resources for the NHS were only made possible by the budget proposed by my right honourable friend the Chancellor back in October. And he's also right to say that as more money goes into the NHS, there is a duty to ensure that it's matched by reform. The 10-year health plan will set out how we will deliver an NHS by creating a reformed and modern health service to ensure that the extra investment results in faster and more convenient treatment for patients, because that is what we all want to see.
Murazza Mittendar, Mr Speaker. In my Camborne, Redruth and Hale constituency, over the course of the last 14 years, child poverty has risen. A third of secondary school children are now persistently absent from school, educational attainment is below the national average, and life expectancy has actually fallen. 14 years of abject failure for which my constituents will never forgive the party opposite. Would the Minister agree with me that the true test of success of our plan for change and a decade of renewal should be measured in the positive changes to the lives of our poorest communities?
My honourable friend puts it very, very well. The missions that we've set out are focused on delivering long-term and ambitious outcomes that will make a meaningful difference to people's lives. Specifically on the issue he raised on child poverty and the best start in life, the plan for change has a specific target to close the development gap between children that are starting school at the moment, and to make sure more children are ready to start school, to learn, and to give them the opportunities that education can bring. Our aim is that people from all backgrounds can benefit from these policies, and that is why the Plan for Change will make a real difference to people's lives in all parts of the country.
Gregory Stafford.
15, sir.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Cabinet Secretary may be asked by the Prime Minister to advise on any matter supporting the smooth running of government, including ministerial appointments. There is no written or published guidance on such matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her response. Since July, we've had 3 ministers who've had to resign from everything from fraud through to unwise entanglements in foreign affairs and everything in between. What steps is she going to be taking to strengthen the ministerial code so that the public can have confidence in the ministers that this Prime Minister seems to be appointing?
Well, we've strengthened the ministerial code, but we don't need to take any advice from the party opposite. What you've seen from this Prime Minister is decisive action to uphold ministerial standards. Compare that with the record of the previous government, where the shadow Foreign Secretary was found guilty of bullying but allowed to keep her post, where the government whipped its MPs to block the suspension of former Minister Owen Paterson, who broke lobbying rules, and where the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, lied about being told of allegations of sexual misconduct by his Deputy Chief Whip.
Shadow Minister Mike Watt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And despite the complacent response from the Minister, we're fewer than 250 days in, and we've already had a Transport Secretary resign over her criminal record, an anti-corruption Minister resign over corruption, questions raised over the checks on the new investment minister, and at least 3 cabinet ministers accused of peddling dodgy CVs. The Prime Minister either can't or won't say whether the necessary questions weren't asked on appointment, whether relevant information wasn't disclosed on appointment, or whether he knew perfectly well about it, but only took action when they were caught. So will the independent adviser now conduct an urgent review on ministerial vetting?
The Prime Minister is determined to uphold high standards of conduct in public office, unlike the previous government. Taken. This is a government in the service of working people, and we will not hesitate to take action against any minister who fails to meet those high standards.
Number 16, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary.
We are taking action to strengthen the UK's resilience. Next month, the UK Resilience Academy will formally launch with the capacity to train over 4,000 people a year. Later this year, we will also be undertaking a full national pandemic response exercise, the first of its kind in nearly a decade. And of course, resilience has to protect the most vulnerable, so we are mapping vulnerability around the country to make sure that in our resilience strategy we can protect people from all backgrounds and of all incomes.
I thank my right honourable friend for his answer. The COVID inquiry found that years of underinvestment under the party opposite meant that our health services were already struggling to cope even before COVID struck, with waiting lists rising years before the pandemic. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that investing in our NHS and tackling the terrible delays that patients, including so many of mine in constituents in Stevenage, experience in receiving treatment is therefore a vital way in which we can improve our country's resilience?
My honourable friend is absolutely right to point to not just specific resilience measures, but the most fundamental thing for national resilience, which is the underlying strength of the country and its services itself. And nowhere is that more true than in the National Health Service. So we are investing in the National Health Service and already seeing the early results of that, with the first fall in NHS waiting lists for years. It is a good start, it is not enough, and we want to build on that progress to treat patients more quickly and indeed to build our resilience in the process.
Question number 18, Mr. Speaker. Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government regularly evaluates the effectiveness of all communication channels, including social media, to ensure they're delivering and providing value for money for taxpayers and that government messaging appears in appropriate environments.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Minister for her answer. After Elon Musk purchased X 3 years ago, ministerial departments have continued to spend money on subscriptions and ads on the site, with one recording more than £400,000 in spend since 2022. Given the lack of adequate content moderation and increase in conspiracy theory peddling, racism and misogyny on the site, often actively encouraged by its owner, does the Minister now think it's right to review government spending on Twitter?
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I know he has a keen interest in these matters. In 2023, the previous government suspended paid advertising on X while reviewing alignment with our safe guidelines. That suspension remains in place. We continue to post content without paid promotion to communicate important government information.
We're Hamas.
Number 19, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is an absolute priority to protect the UK's democratic processes from foreign interference. The Defending Democracy Task Force has been set up to protect the democratic integrity of the UK from such interference. The Prime Minister recently reconfirmed its mandate and the Security Minister chaired a meeting of the task force last week.
I thank the Minister for the answer, as well as addressing foreign interference. Can you update us how we protect the integrity of our own election infrastructure, safeguarding against misinformation, voter suppression and cyber attacks?
Well, Mr Speaker, we've had some earlier exchanges about cyber attacks. It is really important that our democratic processes uphold their integrity and that people who take part in our elections exercise their choice freely without external interference in the process, and the Government is dedicated to making sure that happens.
Now come to topical. Sarah Dyke.
Question number 1, Mr Speaker.
Secretary.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Since our last Cabinet Office questions, new procurement rules have come into force, which will help to deliver growth and drive value for money and, crucially, give small businesses greater access to the nearly £400 billion of government procurement. This also includes stronger new powers to exclude and debar suppliers on grounds of national security and performance. We are also seeking out and reducing wasteful spending, including using AI to go through departmental spending line by line, because it's important that taxpayer funds are used for good public service outcomes, and we are seeing the initial fruits of that through the first reduction in NHS waiting lists for years.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Women in rural areas often face additional barriers to their engagement in politics, both at local and national government levels. Reasons can vary from social, cultural, structural and institutional, but often can be a perceived lack of knowledge. So as we celebrate International Women's Day, what steps is the Minister taking to address these barriers and encourage women in rural areas to access and engage with politics?
Minister.
I thank the honourable member for that really important question. She's absolutely right to highlight the barriers that women in rural areas can face in politics. We want more women in rural areas and around the country elected to local government and to Parliament. We should be proud that this House now has the highest number of women ever elected, including many outstanding women representing rural areas. But we know there is much more we can do.
Catherine Atkins.
Since this Labour government came to power, the list of patients waiting over 65 weeks for treatment at my local hospital trust in Derby has gone down by a whopping 82%. Does the Minister agree that with waiting lists nationally having fallen 4 months in a row, the commitment for an additional 2 million NHS appointments delivered early, our plan for change is already underway? And can he tell the House how his department is working to embed this culture of delivery right across government?
Minister, we are.
I thank my honourable friend for that question. I'm delighted to hear about the falling waiting lists in her constituency. And indeed, waiting lists are falling. Last month we announced we'd met our first step pledge to deliver 2 million additional NHS appointments 7 months early. We are determined to keep up the pace of delivering our plan for change, which the public voted for last year.
Secretary of State Alex Burke.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Why is the government scared of allowing the National Security Advisor to give evidence to the Joint Committee on the National Security Strategy?
Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Secretary will be aware that accountability to Parliament is through ministers. The Prime Minister is regularly accountable to Parliament, and I am very happy to appear before the committee at any convenient time.
Alex Burkhardt. I'm sure the committee will be delighted to hear that, Mr. Speaker. However, there is a precedent in this area. David Frost, now Lord Frost, was an advisor when he gave evidence to the committee in May 2020. The committee is unanimous. The new advisor must appear. The government's own Osmotherley rules say ministers should agree to a request for evidence from any named official, including special advisors. This government promised greater transparency. Why is it breaking another promise?
Mr. Speaker, special advisers are appointed by the minister to whom they advise, and the line of accountability is through ministers to Parliament. That is why the Prime Minister takes questions every week at this dispatch box. The National Security Advisor is an advisor to the Prime Minister, and as I said, I am also very happy, as are any other minister I imagine, to appear before the committee at a convenient time.
To Chair of the Coalition on Secure Technology, I've raised several times in this House concerns over the prevalence of Chinese-manufactured Internet of Things cellular modules. Can I ask the Minister, will the Procurement Review Unit carry out a risk assessment of the risks posed by Chinese supplies of cellular modules in the UK's critical national infrastructure, and will he meet with me to discuss this important issue?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Government takes the security of critical national infrastructure extremely seriously. The UK's national technical authorities, including the National Protective Security Authority, National Cyber Security Centre and the UK National Authority for Counter-Eavesdropping, already provide expert guidance and best practice to owners and operators of UK critical national infrastructure, including on risk assessments and on supply chains, and I'm very happy to meet my honourable friend to discuss this further.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister for Intergovernmental Relations is an extremely experienced minister. So will he cause to be reviewed the quite extraordinary decision to cut the Integrated Security Fund by £120 million? Is this fund not a classic example of how development complements defence demonstrably and effectively? And will he listen to his own side on the great concerns his own side feels at this terrible decision to axe crucial development spending?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman has great experience in this area, and I respect his judgment very much. But he will also have seen the world rapidly change before our eyes in recent weeks. And the leadership task, when the world is changing so fast, is to understand the change, to respond to it, and to explain it. And I believe in the decisions that the Prime Minister has taken in this area in recent weeks. He has fulfilled those obligations in full and in a way that this House is proud of.
Patrick Hurley.
Mr. Speaker, following the recent announcement that the Smedley Hydro government site in my constituency will close in the years to come, will the Minister work with me to ensure that the hundreds of jobs currently based there are relocated at a new site still in the constituency?
Mr. Speaker, I know how hard the honourable member works for his constituency, and I very much understand his concerns. My understanding is there are no changes expected at the Smedley Hydro site in the first instance. The Government Property Agency is actively working with the Home Office and NHS Digital to understand their future workforce requirements, but I would very much welcome a conversation to discuss this further.
Bob Black.
Thank you, Speaker. We've already heard about the cyber attacks that are taking place on public bodies across this country. Clearly, will the Cabinet Secretary ensure that full guidelines are given to every government department about the procurement of software and indeed making sure that security software is kept up to date? because the people that attack us are very rapidly improving their capability, and we must be on top of this.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is absolutely right that the people who are attacking us are trying constantly to probe our defences, and therefore, as I've said a few times in the past hour, this is a constant challenge. It is a combination of hardware, software and good practice, and it applies to both the central government, local government, public bodies and, crucially, businesses themselves. It is a whole national effort to protect the business that we do and the processes that we take for granted every day.
John Rutland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer to my register of interests. Food wholesale and distribution company Bidfood, who have been awarded public sector contracts and have a site in my constituency, recently unilaterally tore up union recognition agreements that have been in place for more than 30 years. Can I ask the Minister what steps they are taking to ensure that trade union recognition and access is valued and considered as part of the process of awarding public sector contracts?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising this critical issue. The Employment Rights Bill will introduce new measures that will give staff and their chosen trade union a meaningful shot at gaining statutory recognition, and I hope these provisions will ensure GMB members across the country can have their voices heard in their workplaces.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister made a speech in December saying that he wanted to put the bureaucracy on a more start-up footing with a Silicon Valley vibe. And in order to achieve that he was going to send in teams, not just teams, Mr. Speaker, but crack teams into Manchester, Liverpool, Sheffield and Essex in order to test, learn and fix by Friday. So, very simple question. In those 3 months, how many of those crack teams have gone in? What have they tested? What have they learned? And what have they fixed by Friday?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for reading my speeches so closely. But I think what is misunderstood is that the teams are on the ground and the process is to learn every week, and I'm glad to report to him that I've already visited a couple of these areas and that good work is underway. And the whole point is it will develop, it will adapt, and perhaps it will be different from the record of his party, which saw a growth of 131,000 in public officials over the last...
I know you mentioned Thursday, Friday. I think we're on Sunday already. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The York Central Development Site is pivotal in driving forward York and North Yorkshire's economy. At the heart of the site is going to be a government hub. Will the Minister meet with me to ensure that the hub isn't separate from the rest of the site, but really integrated in the economic vision we have for York?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and I think it's absolutely critical that government property and government assets are really supporting economic growth in constituencies, including your own, and I would be delighted to meet with you to discuss this further.
Joe Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To great fanfare, the government cancelled the previous government's contract for ministerial travel by helicopter, describing 40 million as grossly wasteful. We now learn the government signed its own contract for ministerial helicopter travel, but it's a secret contract, so secret we don't know how much it's going to cost. Will the Minister confirm, will it cost more or less than 40 million?
Minister.
I think on this one I'll better write to him.
Claire Hazelgrove.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And local people across the Filton and Bradley Stoke constituency have said how much they value and welcome the vast investment we've seen in our public services, from our NHS to our schools and beyond. Could the Minister please set out what steps are being taken to also reform our public services, working together with other Cabinet colleagues?
Well, as I've said a few times this afternoon, reform is important, particularly when the taxpayer has been asked to put extra investment in. That is true in schools as well as in the NHS, because we want to make sure that teachers can do what they want to do, which is teach children in the classroom, and that is also why the best start in life is one of the targets in the government's plan for change published in December.
John Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assessment has the ministerial team made of the productivity
of the civil service in its 8 months in government, and what measures is it putting in place to improve it, and will he report back to the House?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for the work that he did on public sector productivity. I do have to say it was probably essential, given that in the 8 years between 2016 and 2024, the previous government employed an extra 131,000 civil servants. So it's quite right that we look at the productivity for the extra employment sanctioned by the last government.
Sir Desmond Sway.
Does he have an appetite for a policy of like-for-like retaliation when a cyber attack is confirmed from a hostile state?
I have both an appetite and full faith in our excellent intelligence and security services who protect us every day.
That completes questions after Jim Shannon.
Yeah, the best is always last. Minister, what assessment has been made on the volume of apprenticeships offered within the cybersecurity industry, specifically in relation to digital software and hacking prevention online? Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. We want to see more apprenticeships. They've come down compared to where they should be, and the area that he highlights would be a very good and fruitful one for people to learn more about and get the skills they need.
Benches change over.